Yes, I'm based in Oxford and I'm an academic, but that's not all that defines me. And my first engagement with Muslims was really through living in Tunisia. This was pre-revolution, and I was teaching at the university there, and we had a great few years living amongst Muslims. Muslims were my colleagues, my neighbors, my friends, and it gave me a very rich experience early on of Muslims and a certain type of Islam, if you will. I came back to this country in 2002, and whereas when I'd first gone from this country to North Africa, Christians, and certainly in the circles that I was moving in, really weren't interested in Islam. Nobody was talking about it. The Iranian Revolution had been quite far away. Even Salman Rushdie, it was only in the north of England. I lived in the southwest. There were virtually no Muslims in town except at the Indian takeaway. And so why bother? In 2002, everybody wanted to know. And so very quickly we discovered that we were being invited to come and speak at conferences or to go and speak into churches. Who are Muslims? What's Islam? Because obviously 2002 came after the year 2001. And so at that period in my life, I had a bit of a career shift, and I was actually leading a church down in the southwest of England for several years. And so I had a certain amount of insight into, if you like, what Christians in the pews, except we didn't have any pews, it's a nonconformist church, so we had chairs, but what Christians sitting on the chairs were thinking and the questions that they were asking. And some of that actually then led to me doing some PhD research in a sociology department down in Exeter, looking at the question how Christians are responding to Islam in this country. And in particular, I was interested in a particular tradition within the British Church, which was the evangelical tradition, looking at the conversation they were having about Islam and Muslims here. I now, as I said, work in Oxford. I'm based somewhere called the Centre for Muslim Christian Studies, which is it's actually an independent study centre. Even though we're based within the university, we're independent. But we're actually a community of Christians and Muslims trying to do some good quality research on the Christian-Muslim interface, as well as teaching Christians honestly about Islam and teaching Muslims honestly about Christianity as well. So that's a little of my context. And normally when I speak at conferences, I'm trying to be very carefully academic. I hope I'm going to do that today, look at the complexity and the nuance and treat that fairly. But I sometimes leave my faith at the door. Today I also speak as a person of faith, coming from a community that I am both proud to belong to and I'm very glad for, and yet and sometimes quite embarrassed by. And so sometimes I find myself apologizing for my community, and yet I also recognize that I am very much part of that community. So what I'm going to say now is not exhaustive. Some of it's a little bit anecdotal. I am going to tell some stories. And in what I'm saying, I'm not trying to pass judgment on Christians that I'm commenting on. Neither am I particularly trying to champion a particular point of view. When you are asked to speak at one of these conferences and they ask you several months in advance for a title, you think, oh my goodness, a title. Okay, here's a title, here's an abstract. But you haven't prepared anything at that point. And so when it comes time to actually come and speak, you think, oh, that wasn't quite the right title. I wish I'd sent something a little bit different. And then especially once you've been sitting listening to the proceedings of the day, you think, really would have been good to tweak it a little bit. So I've put a strapline on my title today, which is Between Love and Fear. Almost called it Between Philia and Phobia. But I'll leave you to play with that one. Because I think that what I want to do is present something of the way that British Christians are trying to grapple with the presence of Islam, their Muslim neighbours, and what they're to make of all of that. And so if this is a necessarily sort of slightly confused picture, one that seems a little bit, what would you call it, sort of torn within itself, then that's probably because that's the reality on the ground. And I'm just going to frame what I'm going to say between two things that I've read today. One is from the Daily Mail. I do apologise. But the Daily Mail has done me the favour of actually saying that Christian perceptions of Islam are actually still relevant and newsworthy. And so today, the Daily Mail gives us this in advance of a book called Reimagining Britain that the Archbishop of Canterbury is just about to release. And their title is Archbishop of Canterbury says Islamic rules are incompatible with Britain's laws which have Christian values. There you go, you first heard it here, possibly. And in a brief read of the article, they've done an excellent job of saying, this Archbishop, he's our man. He really doesn't like Sharia, so he's obviously standing up for Christian Britain. Whereas the old Archbishop, and you will remember that 10 years ago, the headline was rather different. Archbishop says Sharia law unavoidable, or inevitable, maybe it was. And they say in the article that whereas the old Archbishop wanted to fully incorporate Sharia law into British law, which I don't actually remember him saying, but again, this is the Daily Mail for you. And that shows something of the hysteria of the media, and I really wouldn't want the media to be sort of the conduit of Christian perceptions that you hear. So what I actually want to do is just to give you a little flavour of maybe what not the elite, not the archbishops and bishops are saying, not what the people who make the headlines are saying, but I'm going to give you, as we go through, a few quotes of what those who are writing, maybe more out of the grassroots, are writing. Some of them are academics, or at least they've done some academic study, but they are probably the people that the people in the grassroots go to find out what they should be thinking about Islam. And most of these people, because my study has been around evangelicals, I would describe as people who hold to the uniqueness of Christ. So these would be people who wouldn't easily talk about a Christian pluralism in the theological sense, but who would actually want to say that there is something distinctive about the gospel, about the good news. And I think one of my first observations would be that increasingly that group of people are engaging in a conversation with Muslims in a way that 10 or 20 years ago they were not doing. Traditionally, within that branch of the church, interfaith dialogue has been seen as being an ecumenical practice that in some ways has compromised the gospel. More recently, my friend Joseph Cumming, who's done work at Yale, written something on this, talks about Muslims wanting to engage with that type of Christian because they recognize something of their own faith in that position. And he tells this story about how somebody comes up to him at a conference and says, a Muslim says, "We want to talk with you evangelicals because you believe your scriptures like we believe our scriptures." In other words, this isn't willingness to dilute to the lowest common denominator, but we can have a conversation. And a Muslim said something quite similar to me the other day. We'd been to an interfaith peace vigil after one of the attacks, I think it was in Manchester. And the great and the good in our city had stood up and said, all religions are the same and we all want peace and this is what religion is really about. And this imam who'd been there was talking with us after. He said, "What do you think of that vigil?" And we said, "Well, you know, sometimes we water things down." He said, "Yeah." He said, those Muslims would not have said what they said there if they'd been in the mosque. We need to have a better quality of conversation that can talk about difference as well as about common ground and similarity. And so, just beginning to think a little bit more about the diversity of Christian perceptions, I noticed that it depends very much on people's backgrounds, where they've come from. Particularly, I think it's very interesting, the black African Christian community in this country has a very interesting perception of Islam. When I started to do my research, I thought that they would be very concerned and very antsy about Islam, especially if they were from places like Nigeria. And yet, in actual fact, in the interviews I did, they tended to be like, oh yeah, my uncle's a Muslim, my family's quite mixed. Matter of fact, our church here in London, quite a lot of the people in the congregation have come to Christianity from a Muslim background. It's no big deal, which I thought was quite interesting. That contrast with a white rural Christian community. I sometimes get invited to obscure villages, and when I go there, I often find a very deep-seated ignorance that fuels a real fear of Muslims that we have never known. And so just that geography of background can make a real difference. Often when I listen to those who have done some study and they've actually researched this, I find it actually depends what discipline they've done their research in. Those that have done it in a theological frame often rely so much on text that they get their understanding of what Muslims must believe today from texts that they have read. It might be the classical text, tafsir, and so on. It might be the historical traditions. Might be Quran and Hadith itself. But they read those texts and then draw their own conclusions, very much like they would in their own theological reading of their own scriptures. I find that Christians that have done some study in the social sciences are often prepared to listen to the Muslim voice and say, well, if that's the Muslim explanation of what they say that Islam is, then I'm prepared to think that maybe there is a diversity of interpretation within Islam. So it can depend very much on background of study and knowledge and so on. So a few specific comments, and I'll give you a few quotes here. It's a very strong strain of wanting to say we have to love our Muslim neighbours. Brother Andrew is a very well-known speaker and writer. He says, for me, this is Islam, and he takes it as a mnemonic and says, I sincerely love all Muslims. Yeah, I-S-L-A-M. That's the message that he wants to communicate, that we should love Muslims. And yet, that for some Christians, even though it's writ large all over the gospel, can be quite difficult. I had a member of my congregation come up to me one morning before church service started on a Sunday morning, came up and said, Richard, he said, I know I should love them, but I can't. I said, good morning, Chris. Who? What? He said, Muslims. Muslims, I know I should love them, but I can't. He said, Muslims are the most dangerous organization in the world. My jaw dropped. I was like, Chris, Muslims aren't an organization any more than Christians are an organization. They find it just as hard to organize a tea party as we do. And he was absolutely adamant, though. But he knew he should love, but then he had these other questions. And they're kind of like summed up in this comment from Patrick Sutdeo, who's a very, very well-known, very influential writer on these topics. And he says, whilst Christians are most certainly called to love Muslims, those who have followed this track of affirming and promoting Islam seem unable to distinguish Islam, the theology and ideology, from Muslims, the people. Such Christians have unwittingly embraced Islam, the faith, as they sought to embrace Muslims, the people. In other words, a concern exactly as we were thinking in the session on Islamophobia, still a challenge for us all. Can we separate out ideology and people? And for Suk Deo, he knows he should love, but he also knows that he wants to ask tough questions and feels that there's sort of a conflict of interest there. An antidote to that, Shaukat Mukhari, who's been very involved in development work with World Vision, says Muslims are first and foremost human beings made in God's image and loved by God as much as we are. As disciples of Jesus Christ, we are under a double obligation to love our Muslim neighbours even as we share good news with them. So there's the trope of loving Muslim neighbours. Can they be our allies? Steve Bell, quite another well-known writer, but not at an academic or an elite level really, says this: the real enemy is not the Muslims at all, but the politically correct secularism in this country. And he goes on to say Muslims are actually in this country by the sovereignty of God. It's no accident that Muslims are in this country. And one of the reasons he gives is this: I believe the presence of Muslims in the West should be seen by Christians as a kind of spiritual reinforcement in the battle for biblical morality in a society where secularism is its biggest threat. In other words, there's the possibility of partnership. However, for some others, that is incomprehensible because they see the Muslim presence through the framework of the Islamization of Britain. And David Pawson is a nonconformist Christian, believes he had this sort of revelation prophecy that one day Britain was going to be overtaken and would actually become an Islamic country. I don't have time to read all of these quotes. But the third frame or trope that I'll give you, so that's love, allies, or Islamization. Third, the whole issue around religious freedom. We've been thinking about this in this conference. But I have to say that amongst rank and file Christians, particularly in evangelical churches, they are acutely aware of the situation of Christians in Muslim-majority countries. There are magazines that give accounts of the suffering of Christian communities and so on. Apostasy, a huge issue. This is a group called Open Doors. They publish this thing annually called the World Watch List of the places where it is the most difficult to be a Christian around the world. And I think 38 out of the top 50 countries that they list are actually Muslim countries. And so religious freedom becomes a huge issue. And this is often traced back to Sharia. And Mark Jury is an Australian academic, again, quite widely read in some parts of the church, says the human rights situation of Christians in many Muslim countries has been getting steadily worse over the past half century. This deterioration has been directly linked to the worldwide Islamic revival and reinstatement of Sharia. Not a universally held view. There are other more nuanced views. Michael Nazir Ali sees that there are other traditions apart from the Sharia tradition. But really, just to sum up, going back to my congregation member, Chris, who was caught between knowing he should love and yet fearing that there was some sort of conspiracy or organization of Muslims out there wanting to take over. Colin Chapman, another writer, says this: if Christians find that they are responding to Muslims and Islam more out of fear than out of love, it becomes very much harder for them to obey the commands to love your neighbor as yourself. Christians in this country are in this sort of struggle between love and fear. And the second thing that I just read today was from a book. It's just come out. A guy who's done his PhD. He's actually an American, but we'll forgive him that, and I'll include him because British Christians will read this. And he's written about Christian hospitality in an age of Muslim immigration. And he suggests a middle way that where some recommend building walls, and certainly some of the people I've mentioned would recommend building some very big walls and would support that idea. on the one hand, and where some others would want to throw open the doors and welcome all comers, he suggests that we need some sort of middle discourse, because a house that only has walls is of no help to anybody. A house that only has doors is of no help to anybody. But he suggests that what we actually need is a house with a table in it where we can meet to eat, and says that a house that has both walls and doors that give access to a shared table where we can eat together is what we really need. Thank you.